Dear students, you are welcome back to STR, Shivarajan's teaching room. If any of you has not yet subscribed to this channel, please subscribe and press the bell button for regular updates. See, in our last episode, we had discussed about the oogenesis and the structure of ovum. And I had told you that in the next episode we'll be discussing about the menstrual cycle. Yes, we are going to discuss the menstrual cycle. The menstrual cycle is the reproductive cycle in primates. The reproductive cycle in primates. So the menstrual cycle is the reproductive cycle in primates. What's a primate? Primate is an organism. Is a group of organisms. Is a group of animals. Primates is a group of animals. It includes man, monkeys, apes, gorillas, gibbon, chimpanzee, etc. So these primates. So menstrual cycle is the reproductive cycle in primates. And it begins at puberty. The menstrual cycle begins at puberty. And in human females, the menstrual cycle occurs once in 28 to 29 days. So these are the initial informations that we have to understand. We have to know about menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle is the reproductive cycle in primates, and man is included in the group of animals that come under primates. And the menstrual cycle begins at puberty, that is attaining sexual maturity. And it occurs in man, in human females, the menstrual cycle occurs at an interval of 28 to 29 days. And the menstrual cycle has got 3 stages. The menstrual cycle has got 3 stages. What are they? They are the menstrual flow, follicular phase, and ovulatory phase. So the menstrual cycle includes 3 stages: menstrual flow, follicular phase, and ovulatory phase. What is menstrual flow? Suppose one particular girl has the menses today, and from today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day, so the bleeding remains or continues for the first 4-5 days. So up to the 5th day, there is a bleeding. This period is called menstrual flow. So when the menses begins, there occurs bleeding, and the bleeding continues for the first 5 days of the menstrual cycle. So 1 to 5, the first 5 days is the period of menstrual flow, and this red line I have mentioned here represents the menstrual flow. So it starts from the 1st day to the 5th days. Okay. Then the second phase is the follicular phase. During this phase, the follicular development, when we had discussed the oogenesis, we had seen the follicular development, the primary oocyte getting covered by one layer of granulosa cells, it becomes primary follicle. Then it becomes covered by 2 more layers of granulosa cells and becomes secondary follicle. And it develops a theca around it, and this theca has an outer theca externa and an inner theca interna, and then it develops an antrum inside, becomes the tertiary follicle. The tertiary follicle undergoes meiosis 1 and becomes the secondary oocyte, and then it matures into the graphene follicle. This is the follicular phase. So the primary oocyte develops into primary follicle, secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, and finally the matured follicle, the graphene follicle. This development takes place during the next phase, that is follicular phase. See, then after that, what happens? When the graphene follicle has matured, what happens? Due to the influence of LH and FSH, we had discussed in the previous episode that the graphene follicle bursts and the ovum gets released. So this is the ovulatory phase. What is ovulatory phase? The graphene follicle breaks or ruptures due to the action of LH and FSH, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And the graphene follicle bursts and the ovum is released. This is the ovum. The ovum is released from the graphene follicle. This is the ovulatory phase. So, what are the different stages of menstrual cycle? Menstrual cycle has three important. Menstrual cycle has got three important stages: the menstrual flow, follicular phase, and ovulatory phase. The menstrual flow lasts for the first 5 days, and after that the bleeding stops. Then comes the follicular phase. During this phase, the primary oocyte develops into primary follicle, secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, and finally it becomes the matured graphene follicle. And now comes the ovulatory phase. What is it? Due to the action of FSH and LH, the follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, the graphene follicle bursts and the ovum is released, and the burst or the broken down follicle, graphene follicle, rejoins to become a new structure called the corpus luteum. So the ovum is released, but what happens after that? Once the ovum is released, the broken graphene follicle rejoins to form a new structure called the corpus luteum. So primary oocyte becomes primary follicle, secondary follicle, tertiary follicle, graphene follicle. It bursts and ovum is released. That is called the ovulation. That is ovulatory phase. And the graphene follicle rejoins to become a new structure called corpus luteum. This again, what happens? So by this time it has attained 28 days. Then again, after that, again the bleeding comes. That is after 28 days or 29 days, it is repeated. This is the menstrual cycle. Now, we will see, or we have to see, that the menstrual cycle is controlled by pituitary hormones and ovarian hormones. Pituitary hormones are hormones released from the pituitary gland, and they are the FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone. So pituitary hormones influence the menstrual cycle. Then there is the ovarian hormone. Ovarian hormone means hormones released from the ovary. What are they? Estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone are the hormones released from the ovary. They are called ovarian hormones. And during the menstrual cycle, so many changes takes place in the uterus. These changes are called uterine events. Okay, so we have to see the menstrual cycle in this angle also. How it is influenced by the pituitary hormones, how it is influenced by the ovarian hormones, and what happens in the uterus. That is, what are the changes that happens in the uterus. So we will see one by one. Look here. So this is a group of 3 graphs. This is one graph, this is a second graph, and this is a third graph. The first graph speaks about the influence of the pituitary hormones, that is the FSH and LH, on menstrual cycle. This first graph. See, this is the first day of the menstrual cycle. This is the 28th day of the menstrual cycle. So this is the 14th day, the middle point. So during the menstrual cycle, during the initial stages, see, LH is written below and FSH is written above. What does it mean? The level of FSH is high. The volume or the amount of FSH secreted by the pituitary gland is more. when compared to LH. So FSH level is high and LH level is low. So first day, second day, third day, fourth day, fifth day, it goes on like that. When it comes to the middle point, that means 14th day, see, the FSH and LH increases suddenly. The amount of or the level of FSH and LH increases suddenly, and the amount of LH is considerably more than that of FSH. This is called a LH surge. LH surge. So during the menstrual cycle, on the 15th day of the menstrual cycle or the 14th of the menstrual cycle, what happens? The level of LH increases suddenly. This is called a LH surge, and this increased level of LH and FSH on the midpoint causes rupturing of the Graafian follicle. That is the influence of pituitary hormones. So the FSH and LH, the level of FSH is high in the initial stages, and it grows as the days pass on. The level of LH increases gradually, and by the midpoint, by the 14th day of the menstrual cycle, the FSH and LH level increases very highly, but LH is having a higher level than FSH, and that is called what? LH surge. And this LH surge induces breaking of Graafian follicle and releasing of ovum. So this is the influence of pituitary hormones. Then coming to ovarian hormone level, what are the ovarian hormones? Ovarian hormones are hormones released by the ovaries. They are the estrogen and progesterone. Look here, from the first day onwards, what happens after the menstrual flow, the follicular development takes place. See, this is the primary oocyte. It develops into primary follicle. It develops into secondary follicle. It develops into tertiary follicle and the Graafian follicle. Okay. Now what happens? This is the follicular development. During follicular development, the follicles release estrogen. The follicles are developing primary to secondary to tertiary to Graafian. That means the follicular development is taking place. And when the follicular development is taking place, the follicles release estrogen. So during the first day to the mid period of the cycle, that is 14th day, the estrogen level is high because the follicles are developing and releasing estrogen. And the level of progesterone is low during the first half period. But what happens? After the breaking of the Graafian follicle and releasing of ovum, after the bursting of Graafian follicle and releasing of ovum, what happens? The ruptured Graafian follicle joins to form the corpus luteum. This is the corpus luteum, and corpus luteum releases progesterone. So after the 15th day or after the middle day, what happens? Mid period, what happens? The level of estrogen increases. So follicular development stops here. By the bursting of the Graafian follicle, the follicular development stops here. So the production of estrogen becomes low. But the Graafian follicle joins to become the corpus luteum, and corpus luteum releases or it produces estrogen. So after the mid period, the progesterone level gets increased. So this is the level of ovarian hormones during menstrual cycle. And the uterine events. What are uterine events? So if the ovum is fertilized, it develops into the blastula that we will study later, and get fixed into the endometrium. What is endometrium? The innermost layer of the uterus. But what happens? If it is not developed, the egg is not fertilized, what happens? The endometrium degenerates. The additional tissue developed in the endometrium, degenerates, and gets destroyed, and the blood vessels gets broken and it bleeds. So this is that period. Then comes what? The building up of the endometrium. The endometrium is being built up again it is built up. So from the sixth day onwards, or after the menstrual flow, the endometrium is being built up. It is constructed again. See, by the 14th day or the mid period, the endometrium is fully developed and continues and expects the next ovum to get fertilized. But that also is not fertilized. Then what happens? Again, it gets degenerated and leads to the next bleeding or next menses. So the endometrium degenerates and causes bleeding. Then the endometrium gets built up for the next ovum. Then if that also is not getting fertilized, the built up endometrium again starts degenerating. See, it is coming down. It is again degenerating, and finally it leads to the next menstrual cycle. So here is a menstrual cycle, menses, and here also the next menses. After the 28th day, next menses. So here is one menses and here is another menses. So the total events, the total changes that takes place in the uterus are called uterine events. So there are so many changes takes place in the uterus. This is called uterine events. And in the ovary, what happens? The development of follicles takes place, bursting of Graafian follicle takes place, then the development of corpus luteum takes place. These are the changes that takes place in the ovary. So what are the changes that takes place in the ovary? In the ovary, the follicular development takes place, and the Graafian follicle bursts and release the ovum, and the formation of the corpus luteum. These are the changes that takes place in the ovary. These are the ovarian changes. And what is the uterine? What happens to the uterus? Uterine changes. The endometrium degenerates, leads to bleeding. After that, when the bleeding stops, again the endometrium is being built up for the next ovum. Then what happens? If that also is not fertilized, again it becomes degenerated and leads to the next bleeding. So from one menses to the next menses, or between two menses, what are the changes that takes place both in the ovary and uterus are called a menstrual cycle. The total events, the total changes that takes place in the ovary and in the uterus are totally called as menstrual cycle. So menstrual cycle is the reproductive cycle that takes place in primate mammals, and man or human beings is in that group of animals that come under primates. And it begins after puberty, and the cycle in human females, it occurs in 28 to 29 days. Then this changes. The menstrual cycle has got three stages: menstrual flow, follicular phase, ovulatory phase. And these things, this graph explains the pituitary hormone level during this menstrual cycle, and this graph explains the ovarian hormone level during the menstrual cycle, and the uterine events. This graph explains what are the changes that happens or that takes place in the uterus. So, and the first menses is called menarche. The first menses. So, when the girl is about 10, 11, 12 or like that, during that period, the first menses comes, and it is called the menarche. M-E-N-A-R-C-H. M-E-N-A-R-C-H, menarche. And this continues till 45 or 50 years. So between 45 to 50 years of age, between 45 years to 50 years of age, the menses stops. And this is called menopause. M-E-N-O-P-A-U-S-E, menopause. So menarche is the first menses and menopause is the stopping of menstrual cycle. And that happens between the period of 45 to 50 years in females. Okay, students, I hope you have understood the menstrual cycle. So you make a computer study of these three graphs, how it works, the pituitary hormones, ovarian hormones, and what are the changes in the uterine events, then the follicular development. Okay, so I hope you have understood the menstrual cycle thoroughly well. And in the next class, or the next episode, we will be discussing about fertilization and implantation and other details of pregnancy. Okay, so dear students, bye.